As an undercover FBI agent, Calvin had mastered the art of blending into everyday life. This morning, like many others, began with a ritual that was both comforting and deceptively ordinary. He brewed a strong cup of coffee and toasted a slice of bread until it turned perfectly, if slightly, charred. The scent of burnt toast mingled with the rich aroma of dark roast, setting the stage for a day of quiet dedication. Calvin's mind, ever vigilant, drifted momentarily between the mundane and the profound. He carefully reviewed his schedule for the day while sitting at his small kitchen table. Today's assignments were routine, observing a low-profile target in a suburban neighborhood, but he never underestimated the value of a well-planned day. Every detail, no matter how trivial it might seem, played a role in maintaining his cover and ensuring the success of his missions. After finishing his breakfast, Calvin dressed in plain clothes that allowed him to blend in seamlessly. He checked his equipment, a discreet radio, a notepad, and a concealed service pistol, and took one last look in the mirror. His calm, determined eyes revealed nothing of the intensity that lay beneath his measured exterior. With his mind set on the task ahead, he stepped outside into the cool morning air. The neighborhood, bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun, exuded an aura of serene normalcy. Lawn mowers hummed in the distance, and the chirping of early birds created a gentle soundtrack to the day. For Calvin, these familiar sights and sounds were a welcome respite from the high-stakes world of undercover operations. Yet, beneath this veneer of tranquility, he knew that every day carried its own unpredictable challenges. As he walked down the quiet street toward his car, Calvin couldn't help but reflect on the personal sacrifices his line of work demanded. Each day was a careful balancing act between living an ordinary life and carrying the weight of extraordinary responsibility. Despite the constant tension, he had learned to cherish these small moments of normalcy, the ritual of breakfast, the soft light of dawn, and the comforting rhythm of routine. In that early morning solitude, Calvin Mercer felt a quiet reassurance. No matter what the day might bring, he was prepared to face it with the calm resolve and unwavering professionalism that had defined his career. Today, as every day, was an opportunity to serve and protect, with stealth, precision, and a profound commitment to justice. And so, with a final sip of coffee and a deep, steadying breath, Calvin stepped forward into the unfolding day, ready for whatever lay ahead. As the sun continued to rise over the peaceful suburban streets of Maple Grove, Calvin Mercer had just parked his car near his well-maintained home when an unexpected knock at his door shattered the morning calm. With his heart still steady from the routine of his early hours, he opened the door to find a woman standing on his front porch, a woman whose presence immediately radiated authority and disapproval. This was Veronica Tillman, a longtime neighbor and the outspoken president of the Maple Grove Estates Association. Veronica's sharp eyes took in every detail of Calvin's property. Today, her focus was not on his otherwise immaculate residence but on a specific detail that she found utterly unacceptable: the state of his front lawn. To Veronica, the lawn was slightly overgrown, lacking the decorative flair that she believed every property in Maple Grove should exhibit. Even more, she frowned at the absence of the meticulously arranged garden ornaments. A collection of whimsical gnomes that she was convinced would lend an air of charm and order to any yard. "Good morning," Veronica began, her tone brisk and laced with disapproval. "I'm sure you're aware that our community has standards. Your lawn, frankly, is below par, and I can't help but notice you haven't placed any of those decorative garden gnomes that so many of us proudly display. This is Maple Grove, after all." Calvin, ever the professional, maintained a polite smile. He had long learned that appearances were part of the subtle art of blending in. "Good morning, Veronica," he replied evenly. "I appreciate your concern. I assure you my lawn is being maintained according to my own schedule." Veronica's eyes narrowed as she took a step closer. "That may be so, but there's more. I was under the impression that you were entrusted with a spare set of keys for your home. The previous owner left them with me for emergencies, and I insist you must have them on hand." Her voice carried an edge that left no room for negotiation. "I expect every resident in our community to abide by these protocols." Taken aback by the demand, Calvin hesitated for just a moment. His mind raced. This request was as unexpected as it was intrusive. "I'm sorry, Veronica, but I don't recall any agreement that required me to hand over a spare set of keys. These keys are my personal property, and I'm not comfortable parting with them." The tension in the air grew thicker as Veronica's face flushed with indignation. "This is unacceptable," she declared. "For the sake of community safety, I need those keys. You must understand that it's for emergencies. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to take further action." Calvin's calm resolve did not waver despite the mounting pressure. He had faced numerous challenging encounters throughout his undercover career, and he knew that maintaining a composed exterior was paramount. "Veronica, I understand your position, but I must respectfully decline. My home's security is my responsibility," he said, his tone steady yet firm. Veronica's eyes sparkled with a mix of fury and disbelief. "I can't believe you'd refuse so blatantly. You know, I've served this community for years as president of the Maple Grove Estates Association. I demand that you comply with our established guidelines," she insisted, her voice rising ever so slightly. The conversation, which began with a simple complaint about a slightly overgrown lawn, had quickly morphed into a standoff over keys and community standards. Calvin could sense that this wasn't merely about decorative gnomes or lawn care, it was about asserting control and enforcing an arbitrary notion of order in Maple Grove. Standing there in his doorway, Calvin weighed his options. He valued the privacy and security of his home and had no intention of relinquishing control over his personal property. With a measured, respectful firmness, he repeated his refusal. "I'm sorry, Veronica, but I must decline. My keys are not for distribution. I appreciate your concern for community safety, but I'm confident in the security measures I have in place." Veronica's face hardened as she prepared to leave, her disappointment palpable. "This isn't over, Calvin. You'll regret not cooperating with the standards of our community," she warned, before turning and walking away briskly. As the door closed behind her, Calvin stood silently for a long moment, the weight of the encounter settling on him. He wondered how a simple matter of keys and lawn aesthetics could escalate so quickly. Yet, he also knew that in Maple Grove, even the smallest infractions were often treated with disproportionate severity. With his morning now tinged by the sting of unexpected confrontation, Calvin resolved to continue his day with quiet determination, prepared for whatever challenges might come next. Despite his calm and measured refusal earlier that morning, Calvin Mercer sensed that the confrontation with Veronica Tillman was far from over. As he returned to his routine, preparing his equipment for a day of quiet surveillance, the echoes of Veronica's discontent lingered in his mind. Little did he know that Veronica, embittered by his refusal to hand over a spare set of keys, was about to escalate the matter to unprecedented levels. A short while after their initial exchange, as Calvin was tidying up his front porch and checking his mailbox, he heard the unmistakable sound of rapid footsteps approaching his home. Before he could even wonder about the disturbance, a harsh, commanding voice cut through the morning calm. "This is outrageous. I demand action now." It was Veronica, her eyes blazing with indignation, her stance rigid with authority. Without waiting for a response, Veronica fumbled with her cell phone. "I'm calling the police," she declared, her tone leaving no doubt about her determination. "This man is trespassing on what belongs to our community." Though Calvin's home was clearly his own, Veronica's perception of the situation was tainted by her unwavering belief in her own version of community order. Calvin, standing in the doorway with a calm yet wary expression, could only watch as Veronica's fingers danced over the phone's keypad. In her haste and fury, she began speaking into the phone with an intensity that startled the quiet morning. "Hello, 911. I need immediate assistance. There's a squatter here," she said, her voice rising as she continued. "He's acting suspiciously, and I fear he might be a danger to our neighborhood." As her words echoed off the houses of Maple Grove, Calvin felt a familiar tension coil in his chest. This was not the routine miscommunication of a friendly neighborhood dispute, it was a full-blown accusation of criminal trespassing. He attempted to interject, to explain that he was the rightful owner of the property and that her claims were baseless. However, Veronica's indignation was already in full force, and her words continued unchecked. Minutes passed, each one laden with the growing realization that the situation was spiraling out of control. Calvin could see neighbors gathering in small clusters, their expressions a mixture of confusion and curiosity, as the sound of Veronica's angry declarations over the phone reached them. The gravity of the moment pressed on him. This was no longer a personal dispute, it was becoming a public spectacle. Inside his own mind, Calvin methodically reviewed his options. As an undercover FBI agent, he had been trained to handle unpredictable scenarios, but he had always prided himself on keeping his personal life separate from his professional duties. Now, however, that delicate balance was being disrupted by a single, overzealous neighbor. He resolved to maintain his composure and let the situation unfold, confident that the truth would soon become clear. Veronica's 911 call painted a picture that was both absurd and alarming. "He's aggressive, and he's not cooperating," she continued into the phone, her voice tremulous with fury. "I demand that someone come immediately. This is a clear case of squatting and suspicious behavior." Her narrative was carefully constructed to evoke a sense of danger, even though Calvin's behavior had been nothing but measured and respectful. As the minutes ticked by, the distant wail of sirens began to punctuate the tense air. Calvin's heart pounded steadily, not from fear but from the anticipation of the inevitable arrival of law enforcement. He knew that once the police arrived, he would have the opportunity to present the undeniable facts, his clear ownership of the property, his polite demeanor, and his respectful explanation of the situation. Yet, as he waited, he couldn't help but feel the absurdity of it all. A quiet morning had turned into a chaotic scene, all because of a misunderstanding fueled by Veronica's unyielding sense of entitlement. Veronica, still on the phone, paced back and forth on the front lawn. Her eyes darted nervously from side to side, as though expecting a hidden threat to emerge from the shadows. Neighbors whispered among themselves, their curiosity mingled with disapproval. Some sympathized with her plight, while others quietly questioned the veracity of her claims. For Calvin, the contrast between his own calm, methodical behavior and Veronica's frantic outburst was stark. Every word she uttered over the phone reinforced the growing rift between their perceptions of reality. Inside, Calvin began to compile his thoughts. He rehearsed what he would say to the arriving officers, ensuring that every detail was accurate and clear. He gathered his documents. Proof of ownership, identification, and records that verified his residency, in case the situation required legal clarification. Although his training had taught him to expect the unexpected, this was one of those rare moments when personal and professional lives collided in an utterly unpredictable manner. As the sirens grew louder, drawing ever closer, the tension reached a fever pitch. Veronica's voice, now edged with a mix of desperation and anger, continued to paint Calvin as a dangerous interloper. "He's not cooperating," she shouted into the phone. "I'm telling you, he's a threat to our community." With every passing second, the scene became more surreal, a peaceful suburban morning transformed into a chaotic tableau of suspicion and accusation. In that long, agonizing wait, Calvin's resolve hardened. He would remain calm, he decided, and trust that the truth would eventually prevail. The arrival of the police would serve as a turning point, exposing the baseless nature of Veronica's claims. Until then, all he could do was wait, quietly, confidently, and prepared for whatever came next. Just as the tension in Maple Grove reached its breaking point, the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens cut through the simmering silence. The flashing lights of police vehicles soon came into view along the quiet street, and Calvin Mercer braced himself for the inevitable intrusion of law enforcement into his unfolding ordeal. Within minutes, a team of officers arrived, their presence casting a shadow over the once peaceful facade of his home. Calvin greeted the arriving officers with the calm composure that had become his hallmark. Standing at his doorway, he explained succinctly and clearly that he was the rightful owner of the property and that the disturbance stemmed from a misunderstanding, a simple dispute over keys and a perceived trespass. As he presented his documentation, his tone was firm yet courteous, reflecting the years of experience that had honed his ability to de-escalate even the most volatile situations. Meanwhile, Veronica Tillman, still fuming from her earlier altercation, remained on the lawn. She was visibly agitated, her voice still raised from the earlier 911 call. "He's not cooperating. I'm telling you, he's a squatter," she continued to shout as the officers began their initial inquiries. Despite her fervor, the evidence was mounting against her narrative. Calvin's documents, his calm demeanor, and his clear explanations painted a starkly different picture, a picture of a man simply living his life on his own property. One of the officers, a seasoned veteran with keen eyes, asked Calvin to recount the events leading up to the call. Calvin explained everything meticulously. His quiet morning routine, the unexpected visit from Veronica, her demand for a spare set of keys, and her subsequent decision to call the police. Throughout his account, Calvin maintained an air of respectful assurance, never raising his voice or appearing agitated. His methodical narrative was punctuated only by the occasional nod of understanding from the officers, who began to see the situation in a new light. As the conversation continued, Veronica's accusations grew louder. She leapt into the discussion with a series of rapid-fire statements, claiming that Calvin was aggressively refusing her requests and that his behavior was suspicious. The officer, now clearly skeptical of her version, gently pressed her for specifics. Veronica's responses, however, were vague and contradictory. In her haste to salvage her position, she stumbled over her words, her earlier certainty wavering as the facts piled up against her claims. The tension in the air escalated quickly when Veronica, unable to contain her fury any longer, lunged toward Calvin. In a flash, she attempted to grab the set of keys that Calvin had clutched in his hand, a small but symbolically charged object that represented his autonomy and security. The struggle was immediate and chaotic. In the confusion, Veronica's grip faltered, she tripped, and in doing so, she inadvertently pulled Calvin down with her. The keys fell from her grasp, clattering onto the concrete pathway. In a split second that seemed to stretch into eternity, Calvin's training took over. Reacting with precision and controlled force, he executed an armbar maneuver, an expert technique designed to subdue an opponent without causing serious injury. With a fluid motion, he recovered the keys and maintained his balance, ensuring that he would not be overpowered by the frenzied attack. The brief scuffle drew gasps from onlookers and solidified the stark contrast between Calvin's professionalism and Veronica's escalating aggression. The officers quickly intervened to separate the two, their hands steady as they ensured that no one was injured. Amid the commotion, one of the officers gently restrained Veronica while another escorted Calvin to a more secure area to give him a chance to explain the situation in a calm environment. Even as Veronica's shouts filled the air, the police began to piece together the narrative, a narrative that increasingly portrayed Calvin as a composed homeowner caught in a bizarre series of events instigated by an overzealous neighbor. With the immediate threat neutralized, the officers began to question both parties in a quieter, more controlled setting. It was during this phase that Calvin, with the measured tone of a professional, recounted every detail of the incident. His initial encounter with Veronica, the demand for keys, her call to 911, and the ensuing struggle that had ended with him recovering his property. His clarity and calm demeanor not only impressed the officers but also underscored the absurdity of the accusations leveled against him. Veronica, on the other hand, appeared disheveled and increasingly frustrated. Her earlier certainty had given way to disjointed explanations and even occasional admissions that her version of events might have been exaggerated. The officers listened patiently, and as they cross-checked statements and reviewed Calvin's documentation, a consensus began to emerge. The evidence clearly supported Calvin's account. After a thorough investigation, the officers concluded that no criminal wrongdoing had occurred on Calvin's part. Instead, they determined that the situation was the result of a gross misunderstanding fueled by Veronica's unbridled anger and her misguided perception of community norms. In a final act of order, one of the officers explained the findings to both parties, emphasizing that the matter was now being treated as a civil dispute rather than a criminal incident. As the police prepared to depart, Calvin was left with a deep sense of vindication tempered by the lingering shock of the morning's events. The keys, now securely in his possession, symbolized not only his right to his property but also the power of calm determination in the face of chaos. Even as the flashing lights faded into the distance, the memory of that tumultuous encounter remained, a reminder that truth and professionalism, when steadfastly upheld, could diffuse even the most volatile of situations. In the quiet hours following the police intervention, a peculiar calm settled over Maple Grove. Calvin Mercer, still processing the surreal turn of events, returned to his daily routine with a mixture of relief and lingering caution. The incident, which had erupted from a simple dispute over a spare set of keys, had now transformed into a public spectacle, one that left both him and his neighbor, Veronica Tillman, with scars of misunderstanding. Later that day, as Calvin was checking his emails, he received an unexpected message from the Maple Grove Estates Association. The email was a formal apology, issued on behalf of the HOA, acknowledging that the situation had been misinterpreted and that measures would be taken to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. Calvin couldn't help but smile at the irony. While the email was courteous, he quickly deleted it with a wry nod. The incident, he mused, was far too personal and absurd to be neatly resolved by bureaucratic niceties. As word of the episode spread throughout the community, the fallout was swift and severe. In an unprecedented move, the HOA convened an emergency meeting to address the growing controversy. At this meeting, the board announced that Veronica Tillman, who had been at the forefront of the complaint, would be removed from her position as president of the Maple Grove Estates Association. The decision sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, as many residents had long held mixed opinions about Veronica's domineering style and her relentless enforcement of community standards. News of Veronica's removal rippled through the local media, turning the once quiet suburb into a hotbed of discussion about accountability and the abuse of power. For Calvin, the unfolding drama was both a relief and a bittersweet vindication. His role in the incident had been purely reactive, a man forced to defend his home and dignity against baseless accusations. Now, with Veronica's leadership in question, there was hope that the community might finally move past the petty squabbles that had long plagued Maple Grove. A few days later, in a surprising turn of events, Veronica herself sought out Calvin. With a contrite expression and a measured tone, she apologized for her behavior. "I realize now that I let my frustrations get the better of me," she said, her voice subdued yet sincere. Yet, Calvin, ever the pragmatist, made it clear that her apology was not enough on its own. He set forth a series of conditions as the only way to mend the fractured relationship: a formal written apology, a commitment to volunteer work for the community, and, perhaps most humorously, the purchase of a decorative garden gnome to adorn his yard as a tangible reminder of the incident. Veronica, though initially taken aback by these stipulations, eventually agreed to them. Over the course of the next few days, she worked diligently to fulfill each requirement. The formal apology letter, penned with genuine remorse, was delivered to Calvin's mailbox. True to her word, Veronica also began volunteering at local community events, slowly rebuilding her reputation among residents who had once been critical of her actions. The final condition, buying a garden gnome, proved to be both a symbolic and light-hearted gesture. When Veronica presented Calvin with a brightly colored, ostentatiously designed gnome adorned with whimsical features, even he couldn't help but chuckle. The gnome, which Calvin eventually placed in a prominent spot in his front yard, became a lasting emblem of the day's absurdity. It was a reminder that sometimes, even in the midst of conflict, humor could pave the way for reconciliation. Neighbors would often stop to admire the quirky figurine, and it soon became a beloved oddity that lightened the mood whenever conversations turned to the once explosive dispute. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in Maple Grove gradually shifted. The removal of Veronica from her leadership role and her sincere efforts at restitution sparked a broader conversation about fairness, accountability, and the importance of community harmony. Residents began to question the strict, often arbitrary standards that had long governed their interactions, and many welcomed the change as a step toward a more inclusive and understanding environment. For Calvin, the entire ordeal had been a whirlwind of unexpected challenges, a day that had begun with burnt toast and coffee and escalated into a dramatic confrontation with far-reaching consequences. As he looked at the cheerful garden gnome in his yard, he reflected on the importance of resilience, humor, and the ability to forgive. Even the most entrenched disputes, he realized, could eventually yield to reconciliation when approached with dignity and a touch of levity. In that moment, Calvin Mercer found not only a renewed sense of peace in his home at Maple Grove but also an enduring reminder that sometimes, the most absurd conflicts could lead to the most heartening resolutions. The incident, with all its chaos and comedy, had left a mark on the community. A mark that, over time, would evolve into a cherished memory of growth, understanding, and the unpredictable nature of human relationships.